Former foes, now strategic partners. The NATO alliance, originally set up to counter the Soviet Union, has welcomed the Russian president to what's been dubbed one of the most important summits in its history. Will it bring a new era of cooperation between NATO and Russia? Will Russia join the battle against the Taliban and approve a missile shield in Europe? And what will Russia get in return? This is Inside Story. Hello, warm welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. The annual meeting of NATO's 28 members has set up the prospect of unprecedented cooperation with Russia. And NATO's Secretary General has heralded a new phase in the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan. A lot of progress has been made in Lisbon. NATO adopted a 10-year action plan. It highlighted fresh threats from cyber warfare to diminishing natural resources. The US president announced a new missile defense system for Europe that would cover all NATO member countries. Russia was invited to cooperate, but without joint control. And an exit date for combat troops in Afghanistan was agreed as 2014. Russia was asked to provide 28 new helicopters for the Afghan army. The US-Russia START treaty to cut down on nuclear weapons was endorsed, but the alliance said it must maintain its deterrent until the world was nuclear-free. Joining us now to discuss this issue are our guests in Beirut, Alistair Crook, founding director of the Conflicts Forum and former Middle East advisor to the EU, and in Lyon, Rabah Ghazaleh, a contributing writer for Huffington Post on the geopolitics of transatlantic relations. Mr. Ghazaleh, I mean, let's talk about the relations between NATO and Russia. They haven't got closer. I mean, we're seeing an absolute love in there. What do you make of that?
Oh, I think that this agreement between NATO and Russia today is perhaps not historical, but tends to be quite a positive thing. When you think of it, I mean, Russia agreed on most of the NATO's agenda, but I will say that's as well, how to say that, a victory for Russia, because I mean they have been able to get some trade-off out of their negotiation. They got some good bargaining position. So on that, I think that this agreement is mutually positive as much as for NATO than for Russia.
Mr. Crook, what do you see as the worldwide impact of this new relationship?
I think that Russia is going to approach this very much more cautiously. In fact, than you indicate. I think it will be quite cautious. For a start, it really will want to see what is the true intention of NATO. Who is it going to identify as its enemies for this coming period? And there's still a strong pressure within the new Europeans, the Polands, the Czechoslovakia, to see the missile defense of Europe as essentially a defense against Russia, not against anybody else. And Russia is very much aware of it, and it's trying to work out if there's a chance to come to terms with NATO in a way which they can, if you like, diffuse that threat against itself and at the same time make some benefits out of a closer relationship with the United States. But I think Russia, despite the warm words from Medvedev, is very much in a mode of waiting to see how this will turn out, waiting to see what emerges, and is very much aware that although there are positive signs here, there are very different signs emerging from the Secretary of State, Mrs. Clinton, who is telling some of the former Soviet republics that America can both chew gum and walk, i.e. can both support the former Soviet republics against Russia and at the same time have a better relationship with Russia. The reset is very far from certain.
Okay, let's address some of the issues that have been highlighted during this summit. Let's talk about Afghanistan first. I asked NATO spokesman James Apatorai what Russia's involvement in Afghanistan would be.
Russia is providing support to NATO, not least because Russia has an interest, a shared interest, in stability in Afghanistan. The terrorism, extremism, and in particular the drugs coming out of Afghanistan in many ways hit Russia just as much as everybody else, sometimes first. So they are helping us by providing their territory for supplies, and we're going to do more of that. We are training Afghan counter-narcotics officials and neighboring states' counter-narcotics officials together. And we are going to do more in terms of supplying the Afghans with equipment. So it is a partnership which ironically perhaps is bringing Russia and NATO closer together.
Mr. Crook, strategically, how do you think both NATO and Russia would benefit from this relationship in Afghanistan?
I think for Russia, it's essentially about asserting its position in southern Asia. It's about, if you like, preventing others moving into the former Soviet space there. But in fact, I mean, what they're doing in many ways is regarding Afghanistan is a matter of business, of conducting business, of selling helicopters, of providing supplies. I don't think after their experience in the 80s that Russia has any desire at all to get involved in Afghanistan. In fact, they have many lessons which they have tried to persuade the Americans to learn about the dangers of a continued occupation of Afghanistan, and they learnt them very painfully. But if people want to buy their helicopters, they're happy to do that. If they want to set up bases and pay money for them, Russia is happy for that too.
Because, of course, an unstable Afghanistan poses a big problem for Russia in the future, doesn't it? How it can feed its insurgencies on its borders.
Well, it depends how it's unstable in the sense. I don't think that Russia would think of the Taliban per se, as the West does, as itself a form of instability. They would regard some elements of it as being unstable, but they're very clear that the Pashtun, which is the ethnic group from which the Taliban come, are the majority in Afghanistan and have ruled Afghanistan over the centuries. The idea that they can be excluded from any relationship, I don't think would be acceptable to Russia at all. They'd be very keen on having some form of stability, which is not about defeating and destroying the Taliban at all. It's about finding some form of power sharing that could serve in the longer interests, both of Russia and the region.
Mr. Ghazali, what concessions do you think will be made to Russia now?
In terms of, I think the main issue for the Russian is obviously the enlargement of NATO. What about the case of Georgia, Ukraine, and perhaps in the future countries like Finland, which are a direct border with Russia? And I think that's the main concession that the US will have to deal with at some point. I mean, dealing with Russia, the Russians are pretty fearful that NATO would extend to those countries. So on one side, that's I think the main concession that the US and the Western Europeans have given to Russia. I
guess that awkward questions about Russia's involvement, excuse me interrupting, awkward questions about Russia's involvement in the Georgian war will be ignored.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Will Russia's involvement in the Georgian war be ignored now? Will that be sort of swept under the carpet?
Oh, I think that to some extent, I mean, in order to, if we wanted to have the missile shield to be, to be agreed on, we had to make a certain concession, especially in terms of perhaps forgetting a bit of the past history regarding the past conflicts between Russia and Georgia. But I think that one thing that will be of importance dealing with the Russian in the future is all those frozen conflicts in those former Soviet republic in which Russia has a stake and with which they can easily can get involved, and which is perhaps not very positive for the stability of Caucasus and part of Eastern Europe.
But wouldn't the former republics be happy with this warming of ties between Russia and NATO? Wouldn't it serve in their best interests?
Oh, I think so, necessarily. I mean, I think that, having as many friends as possible is very positive, but we should as well make the difference between the different components of NATO. If President Obama is having a good relationship with President Medvedev, that's all fine for US interest. And I think that most Western countries, France, Britain, Germany, especially Germany, would like to have positive relationship with Germany. The rest is the ability to convince Poland, the Baltic states, and basically the former European country which were under Soviet influence during the Cold War to agree for a better understanding and a better relationship with Russia. I mean, it's one thing to be in Paris and London or Washington and to think that, well, dealing with the Russian and making agreements is positive, but I think that in Warsaw or Bucharest, they tend to have a different understanding on the NATO-Russian cooperation and agreement.
Okay.
So on that, I mean, there is a lot of...
I want to bring it back to Afghanistan, if you don't mind, and speak to Mr. Crook about this. Do you think bringing Russia in will negate the effect of working with Pakistan? I know that the US and NATO are very disappointed in Pakistan's involvement.
I think you should be very clear that the Russians will have no desire to get entangled in a failing war in Afghanistan. I mean, we're talking as if this war is being a success. In fact, it's being a failure. And I think Russia, more than any state, understands that from their past experience. It's one thing to sell if they want to buy and provide the funding to sell helicopters and provide other forms of supplies. But I think you'll find Russia has no desire to get in this process. I mean, going back to your...
carry on.
I was going to say, going back to your earlier point, I think what you have to underline is Russia is by no means settled on this process. It's a very controversial process in Russia itself. The idea of trying to come closer to America, especially when it seems to many Russians that the Americans are actually still asserting their right to be involved in the former Soviet republics in Russia's sphere of influence, are still supporting and encouraging states like Georgia, and are still talking to the former Soviet republics of expansion of NATO. And as we see, most of this meeting today, this conference, is about the expansion of NATO taking a global role. Well, Russia also has to balance its relationship with China, too, on this. And it's very clear that if there is an enemy, if there is someone that is being contained, that is not spoken about in this meeting, it's clearly about slowly hemming in China in Asia and in that area that is the fundamental purpose of this meeting.
Right, you talk about NATO expanding. NATO is talking about this transition date as 2014. As Mr. Crook was saying there, I mean, the war's hardly been a success in Afghanistan. So I asked NATO if this was a reality to withdraw, to scale down by 2014.
We're not talking about withdrawing and leaving. What we're talking about is changing roles. Our aim is that steadily over the next few years, Afghan security forces take the lead in security operations, but we will still be there in a supporting role, in a training role, in an overwatch role. And that is very realistic, and we are quite confident that it will happen.
Let's leave Afghanistan now and talk about this missile defense shield. You both have touched on it. And I asked NATO again what Russia is likely to get in exchange for allowing this defense shield to go ahead, to partner it.
It's not a question of compensating Russia. We want to cooperate with Russia. What you'll see out of the Lisbon summit is precisely an offer to the Russian Federation from NATO, now that we've taken the decision to do missile defense as an alliance, an offer to Russia to cooperate with us, not to create one system, but to link up the already existing Russian system with the developing NATO system so that we have a more effective coverage and protection for European territory and population.
So clearly that's going to take a lot of money. Let's look at the spending behind all of this. With defence budgets being slashed across Europe, the US is picking up ever more of NATO's bill, and it's investing so much more in military technology that is getting harder for Europe to coordinate on operations. The US is already looking to partnerships with tech-savvy allies such as South Korea. Will money matters lead to a weakened NATO? Here's a quick check of the numbers. For the first time in its 60-year history, NATO is in debt. In 2009, it was missing around 25% of its annual $2 billion budget. In 2009, only 5 of the 28 allies met the minimum spending requirement of 2% of national income. Albania, Britain, France, Greece and the US. US defence spending makes up 73% of the budget, up nearly a quarter in the past 10 years. Europe's trying to overcome the spending gap with strategic partnerships. One such recent deal agreed by Belgium, France, Germany and the Netherlands pools 200 transport aircraft under one command. France and Britain also signed a deal. Mr. Crook, this really poses quite a problem, doesn't it, and highlights a widening split within NATO between the US and European countries. The US is coughing up so much of the cash, so much of the military hardware, where Europe seems to be taking more of a back line to this.
Precisely. It's a problem also because it's fundamentally a deceit. We have to ask, what is this missile umbrella is going to be used against? I mean, you've just spoken about the warming relations between Russia. Well, then why are we having missiles put right up on the border in Poland and Czechoslovakia? And here again is the sort of, if you like, the contradictions in this policy. Of course, they don't say it, but ultimately they say, well, really, it's against Iran. Of course, Iran doesn't have those sort of missiles that threaten Europe. No one in Europe really believes that Iran threatens Europe. It's going to take over Britain or Germany or Brussels. So who is the defense against? So under the pretext of defending against Iran, this missile defense system is being put in basically to contain Russia in terms of Europe. And of course, it makes no sense if at the same time they're going to try and bring Russia in. Russia's strategy, of course, must try to be, if you like, to engage as much as possible to limit the threats to it and the danger. So in the end, it becomes an expenditure for almost nothing, because if Russia becomes part of it in order to limit the threat to Russia, which it's very sensitive of, what's the purpose of this great expenditure in the first place?
Well, I asked NATO again if Europe's dramatic cuts in military spending would hurt the alliance.
We don't want to see, as NATO, a growing imbalance between the United States and Europe when it comes to military capability. That's why the Secretary General is pushing hard for our European allies to cooperate more, to pool money, to pool resources, so that together we can afford what individually might be more and more difficult to afford.
Mr. Galazi, will the signing of the START treaty, will that help in any way?
I think we have to remember that the SALT is between, strictly speaking, Russia and United States. It helps on one side because it helps Moscow and Washington having a better relationship, though we don't know if the Congress is going to ratify this SALT treaty. And on the other side, I mean, we have to bear in mind that within the European component of NATO, there are vivid debates between, for example, France, that is willing to keep its force de frappe, its nuclear power, and Germany that tends to think that we should naturally go towards SALT agreements, meaning declare disarmament. And on that, I'm not too sure if it creates a new line of divide between the different components of NATO. So if it helps getting a better, if it helps United States getting closer to Russia, why not? If we think of SALT as creating a new dynamic within NATO, I don't think so. And right now, as you mentioned, the main problem is going to be how to reach a certain level of spending, not knowing that NATO in itself needs to do some spending cuts. The number of military officers is going to be decreased by 4,000. The number of headquarters is going to be reduced. The number of agencies, which are now about 14, is going to be limited to a number of 3. So we are at a time of massive savings on the defense policy, which will have undoubtedly some terrible consequences in the future.
Well, it certainly does raise the question about NATO's future and if it really does have a future.
NATO has the ability to generate, deploy and command very robust military operations. There is no other organization that can do this. And Afghanistan, despite its difficulties, is a case in point. We will be called on again, but we'll also be called on to do cyber defense and missile defense and partnership with the UN and the EU. All of those things will be strengthened based on the decisions we took here in Lisbon.
Mr. Ghazali, do you think we should be happy having NATO with all the problems that it faces as the world's policeman?
I think that's, at least from a European perspective, that helps. I mean, knowing that basically we put effort in common. And from a purely selfish European view, I mean, we tend to hope that, you know, at some point there will be perhaps, you know, some kind of fusion between NATO in itself and European defense policy. So on that, there is no doubt about the value added that brings NATO. The main problem of NATO is what to do after the collapse of the Soviet Union, since, you know, the end of the Cold War. What's the use of NATO? So that's an organization that tries to find and rediscover its identity. So I mean, the fact that they are talking on the strategic documents about the new mission regarding, you know, cyber war and energy supply and the rest tends to show that NATO is trying to find itself. And regarding more involvement in the rest of the world, we should perhaps, I mean, wonder, I mean, if the center of this type of discussion should not be some kind of democratic organization like the UN, rather than NATO, which is supposed to be only a military arm of not only the Western world, but as well of perhaps, I mean, to the UN, as the role was played in Afghanistan. So we have to bear in mind that's a military, defensive military alliance. And on that, redefining a new identity and a new set of
let's
mission
put that new identity and question,
the most important
excuse
thing
me,
nowadays.
interrupting, of NATO's future to Mr. Crook. Is there a future for NATO?
I don't think in this form. Your colleague there has just outlined the main missions, and the missions that they talk about are what they put as emergent threats. And they talk about that as cyber war, terrorism, crime, other issues, food shortages. You don't need massive missile defense shields for these sort of threats. You don't need massive conventional armies, tanks and other forms of, if you like, conventional NATO forces. You need something very, very different. And what I think we're seeing instead is a huge expenditure building up in terms of bases. The United States is building a huge embassy come base in Kabul that won't be ready until after 2014. Another one in Herat. I mean, these are almost billion-dollar projects with 1,000 people involved in them, just as they have in Iraq and Baghdad. Now also they're doing in Africa. It's an attempt to be able to project force globally, to become, if you like, able to intervene anywhere on any issue. So in a sense, I mean, there is no actual meaning in terms of trying to reinterpret itself towards such a diffuse and hard to identify targets in terms of the conventional weaponry that NATO is spending so much money on. And certainly that does need a debate, and it actually needs a rethink. And all we get here, in a sense, in this meeting, seems to be an attempt, if you like, to have a public relations exercise in order to give some sort of sense to a continuing program of building bases, of intervening in Africa, in the Middle East and Asia.
Okay, let's leave it on that note. Alistair Crook, thank you very much for talking to us from Beirut, and you and Leo Rabah Ghazali, thank you so much for joining us, the viewers, here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions, as always. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.